All right. Like the room has converged, I'll introduce Emre. It's our great pleasure to have Emre Kiciman here, who joins us from Microsoft Research. Emre got a PhD at Stanford. He is maybe best known for his work on causal inference, including developing the DoWhy library, also writing a book on it, and has done many tutorials, many of which we actually use here in our classes at UW. So it's our great pleasure to have you, Emre.
Thanks so much, Tim. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm excited to speak with you about some of the work we've been doing recently. The title of this talk is Modeling the Data Generating Process is Necessary for Out-of-Distribution Generalization. And this is joint work with Jivat and Amit from MSR India. And what I'm going to cover briefly is some context about our kind of umbrella of work on causal AI at Microsoft Research, including our open source tools and how that influences what we choose to work on in terms of our fundamental research challenges. The bulk of the talk is going to be then that is going to be pulling from an ICLR paper that was recently accepted, where we make connections between robustness against distribution shifts and underlying causal models of the system. And we use this to explain why current algorithms don't work consistently across all distribution shifts, and how we can use these insights to create an adaptive algorithm that does. Let me get into that kind of context. I want to start by reviewing a little bit about what we think of as being a causal question. What are people asking in practice? And these are questions that people ask from across a wide variety of domains that really focus in on something about a cause and effect relationship. What is the impact of a marketing campaign? If you think of the marketing campaign as a cause, what is its impact in terms of influencing people's behavior, their purchase decisions, et cetera? Or, how do farmer practices affect soil carbon sequestration? What does tilling or fertilizing or planting cover crops do to the ability of soil to capture soil carbon, especially in a complex situation where there's other nitrogen cycles and other things going on simultaneously? What are the long-term effects of the disease? How do AI models generalize across hospitals? There's such a huge variety. In fact, I'd argue that most kind of scientific and certainly most decision-oriented applications are really at the heart of a causal question. Now, we have lots of great machine learning methods to analyze data, and they are kind of have been one of the drivers, like the inspirations for people thinking about applying computation to the wide variety of domains we've seen before. But it turns out that for many of these problems, current kind of correlational machine learning approaches are insufficient, simply because correlation machine learning searches for patterns, but often the patterns it finds are spurious ones that mean that they are not robust when you go to deploy these models in practice. And just to say a little bit more about that, we see that machine learning captures patterns that are spurious, but then when those patterns change in deployment, the machine learning model starts to fail. So we can take a simple, a task as simple as just digit recognition in MNIST, and find that if we just start to rotate the digits a little bit beyond what was seen in the training data, all of a sudden digit recognition accuracy drops significantly. Or if we rotate a 3D object, we start to get very kind of surprising classifications of what those objects are. And this is, these are kind of toy kind of lab problems, but we see the same type of issue happening in practice. At the beginning of the pandemic, hundreds of different labs around the world started building COVID classification models that looked at chest scans, CT scans to diagnose whether someone's lungs were affected by COVID. And in follow-up studies in 2021 and 2020, meta-analyses found that none of these models were actually fit for use in practice. All of them suffered from some kind of significant problem that prevented them from being used. And many of these problems were identified as being due to false correlates. For example, in one model, the data for the chest scans came from a hospital where people were allowed to either sit down or sit up for their chest scans or lie down. And of course, the sicker patients lay down. and they were the ones who tended to have COVID. So the machine learning model that analyzed the chest scans actually found it easier to detect whether someone was lying down and use that to predict COVID status rather than actually looking at the signature of the illness. Similarly, another data set showed that was created where all of the non-COVID patients were kids. So the pediatric scans were the only examples of people without COVID. And that meant that that particular model just simply looked to see whether you had a chest scan of a child. And if so, mark that as not being COVID. That's obviously neither of these models were then kind of give you reliable results when you switch to a different hospital, different policies or a real kind of data set. Now, we talk about these distribution shifts. I want to point out that distribution shifts like this are particularly problematic in decision-making applications because active decision-making from using the output of a model can actually change the data distribution itself. So your application, by definition, using the model, breaks the assumptions of an ML model that's assuming that your training data is IID from your deployment environment. So here's one example just to kind of illustrate that. Let's say we want to irrigate a field based on predicted soil moisture levels. Well, we can take years worth of data from real fields and predict what the soil moisture level is going to be based on expected weather. And then we can ask that, what's the soil moisture level going to be given that it's going to be super hot in 2 days? And our model is going to say very confidently, don't worry, if it's super hot in a couple of days, soil moisture levels are going to be fine. And you're going to say, well, I don't have to irrigate them, right? But that doesn't make sense. It's the wrong answer. Why is the model saying this? Well, it's because it was trained on past data where the farmer, of course, always watered, irrigated on super hot days, because that's what you should be doing, right? And when we suddenly change our action policy based on the output of this model, we are now changing the underlying data distribution. We can think of this as being, we can draw this out a little bit more formally and say that we've got a causal graph where temperature is affecting both soil moisture level and our irrigation status through a farmer's policy. And the irrigation then is also affecting the soil moisture level. Because there's like this multi-collinearity going on, both temperature and irrigation are predictive of soil moisture level. We can actually, this is an underspecified model, and we can find many different solutions that are valid as long as the relationship between temperature and irrigation does not change. But as soon as we modify that farmer's policy, we're going to get into a problem where we can no longer predict soil moisture level. We aren't predicting soil moisture levels correctly. To fix this, we want to basically estimate the results of a different joint distribution of data. We observe the joint distribution under a specific farmer's policy. We want to estimate the joint distribution where temperature and irrigation are actually independently controlled, and we can apply whatever policy we want. And I won't go deeply into this, except to say the causal reasoning enables you to do these kinds of analyses, but it relies strongly on initial assumptions about the domain knowledge of the causal structure. We have to know, which direction are these arrows going, which direction is the farmer's policy going, are there other confounding factors, etc. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we know if we're right? Those are the two fundamental challenges for causal machine learning. It's that we can't just look at the data distribution itself to figure out which direction all those arrows go in, what are the causal mechanisms. It turns out that by theory, multiple causal mechanisms can be fit to basically any single data distribution. And we need to bring in domain knowledge and assumptions from outside of that data set in order to be able to correctly apply a causal analysis. The second challenge is that when we go to evaluate our results and see if our estimation of causal effects is true or not, we can't do that directly from the data. We actually never get to observe the counterfactual world that would allow us to calculate what the true effect was. And so this gives us challenges in validation. Cross-validation is no longer something we can use in this scenario. So the approaches that we're taking to address these is basically to improve the scaffolding for best practices. make sure that people think very carefully about their domain knowledge and assumptions, and make sure that they do as much to validate their underlying assumptions, refute whatever they can based on the data that is available. For this purpose, we've built the DoWhy open source library for causal inference that puts these assumptions and their validations front and center. It's currently the most popular causal library on GitHub. We have a couple million downloads, and what I'm really excited about is we have a growing community of open source contributors from Microsoft, Amazon, MIT, CMU, a bunch of universities making significant contributions. We're growing this into a larger causal suite of tools. DoWhy is the library that provides that's scaffolding for these best practices. EconML is our sister library from Microsoft Research in New England that provides very sophisticated estimation methods for the latest causal ML and fits in with DoWhy. We have Causica, a library for deep learning methods for causal discovery, and AshowWhy, a suite of no-code interactive tools that places a nice kind of interface for data analysts atop the underlying Python libraries. And really pushing for kind of building an open source community. We've moved out of our kind of Microsoft open source organization to an independent community-driven governance model at PyWhy, and really have seen like a lot of uptick and growing community because of that. One of the reasons why we're doing this is that we see getting these tools out there in practice, both as an end of its own. We believe people should be adopting more of these methods in practice, but also it helps us get greater insight into what are the biggest needs for research, for fundamental research advances. And so we see that people have a really hard time encoding their domain knowledge, taking kind of the domain expertise and figuring out what type of causal graph they need to translate it into. And we have a number of projects going on to address that. We find a need to apply causal analysis over new kinds of data, high dimensional data, unstructured data like text and images, whereas most causal methods today are working on tabular data of some form. Even though some of it is high dimensional tabular data, we see we need to go further to get at the richest sources of information for many of the applications we care about. And then finally, that validation method. How do we integrate this with A/B experimentation, other kinds of empirical validations, and then improve our analytical characterizations as well. So I'm going to transition now to that main kind of work on representation learning and causality. That is fits into this causal analysis of a high dimensional data. I'm going to start talking about how causal graphs match up to basically representation learning in the context of images. So this is that transition point. But this is a good time, actually, if there's any questions about this. All right. Yes.
I'm a little curious now, this might be outside the scope of the talk, but transitioning from kind of an internal open source project to an externally governed open source project, was that like a challenging thing to pitch? Or like, was that transition smooth?
No, I mean, yeah, that's a great question. Open source overall is pretty well supported at Microsoft. We have lots of open source projects. The shift from a Microsoft governed open source project where it's like basically, github.com/Microsoft/project name to one that's outside of that organization is basically motivated when you have lots of other people who want to start contributing. Then it's usually, if you want to get to that point or you are getting to that point, then it's better for it to be outside of Microsoft for the community. And so that's the main driver. And there's like, an open source strategy team that helps you think through the trade-offs and everything. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I want to start off by kind of giving a little bit of background on state-of-the-art domain generalization algorithms. Then I'll get into ties into causal methods and then kind of our algorithm and approach and insights. So this is a chart from OOD Bench, a CVPR paper by Ye et al. in 2022. And this and a couple of other works found that when looking at data sets that represented distribution shifts that are used to test domain generalization algorithms, Do your model that's built on one set of data continue to work well in a new set of data that wasn't in the initial training set? That if they divided up the data sets by how much they represented different kinds of distribution shifts, where a diversity shift was something like seeing new kinds of data that weren't seen in your initial training data, but it's not necessarily correlated with your target label, versus correlational shifts, where some of the signals that were correlated with your data and your training data set now are changing, and your correlation it was basically a spurious correlation, and that correlation is no longer consistent across your deployment data. That different data sets represented kind of different points along this axis of how much was their diversity shift in their terminology and how much was a correlational shift. And they went ahead and tested a bunch of state-of-the-art algorithms against these different data sets and found that no one algorithm actually did well against both of these different kinds of distribution shifts. Algorithms that did well on diversity shifts didn't do well on correlation shifts, and vice versa. And the kind of standard ERM actually was kind of smack in the middle, and on average did actually the best, which was, really fascinating. Why is this the case? Why is no algorithm doing better overall? Wiles et al. Did a similar analysis. They use slightly different terminology, spurious correlations and unseen data shifts, but it roughly matches up with correlation shift and diversity shift. And they found consistent findings that no one algorithm did well on both kinds of data shifts. And when we look a little bit deeper at some of the other benchmark data set, like the Wiles data set, we can see similar cases where there's not only one shift happening under the covers, but actually multiple shifts happening. So in, for example, this satellite imagery data set from Wiles, you see both kind of geographic and land type distribution shifts happening across the train and test data. And so when we wanted to study this multi-attribute problem a little bit deeper as well, to go along with this single attribute shift problem. They're a little bit more realistic. You always have multiple attributes in real world data, and there's no reason to believe that they're going to shift similarly. And here we see that, yeah, accuracy decreases even further for all these algorithms as well. And we tested that based on a version of MNIST that combined rotation and color together, where we could control each of them independently. And so our findings, to give a little bit of a preview, explains from a causal perspective why no existing algorithm works across both of these types of distribution shifts. The differences arise due to differences in the underlying data generating process. And if you look at that data generating process with a causal perspective, you realize that it leads to different independence constraints that have to be imposed on your data. And no single independence constraint actually works across all different types of causal graphs. You have to pick the right independence constraint for your particular data generating process. But once you do that, then you get great results. And so we then developed an algorithm based on that insight that analyzes the causal graph to pick out the correct set of independence constraints to impose when you're doing your learning, and then generalizes from not only the single attribute case to the multi-attribute case. So let's go into a little bit more detail in terms of what I mean by representing distribution shift using a causal graph. So in this graph, what we see is kind of a canonical setup where we are observing two variables, x and y. You can think of x as being our image and y as being the target label that we're trying to predict. The target label in this setup is actually our label of what the original object is. So you can think of like the object as being a cow or a camel or some other animal. It is creating some signature of itself, x sub c, that then is seen in the final image x. this latent X sub C is also what is causing the label Y to occur. So the causal features X sub C now is what we're going to try and pull out of X. Can we identify the subset of X that's due to X sub C, ignoring everything else? And we believe that X sub C then is going to be robust and is going to allow us to correctly predict Y across a wide variety of environments. Now, there's other things that are influencing X as well. So if you're trying to classify an animal, there's obviously other background features. There's, is it grass or sand? What else is in the picture? Those are these attributes A. And we pull out multiple different kinds of attributes that might exist based on the causal relationship they have to our target label Y.
Would it be correct to call X sub C the invariances of the data that cause labels?
Yes. Yeah. So if you're from the invariant representation learning perspective, that is the invariant. That's the invariant model. Yeah. So these attributes A int, we're going to call A int is any attribute that's independent of the target label. We're going to call then things A int bar as being things that are not independent of the label. And then we have this kind of catch-all environment label E that can influence both of them. And of course, when we look at the not independent relationships, the A int bar, those can be of different kinds. We can have a relationship where Y is causing this attribute. We call that A sub cause. We can have a situation where there's a latent confounder that's causing both Y and A and the attribute A. And then we can have a selection bias where Y and A are both causing this latent variable, and that's then causing some sort of filtering to happen. So we only see a subset of the data. All of these induce a correlational relationship between A in bar and Y, and we want to make sure we disentangle that appropriately. During our setup, we're going to assume that we have access to all of these A attributes during training time. And that's what's going to help us disentangle the parts of X that are due to A as opposed to X sub C. But then once we then go to deploy this model in the real world, we no longer need to have access to A. We can just look at X and extract out X sub C based on the model that we've learned.
Can you just also kind of the examples you've been giving of not just X-rays or animals? What are the examples of Y actually causing A?
Oh, Y causing A. So for example, if you have someone's COVID status causing signals of COVID in their chest scan, and then that actually causes them to lie. So that's their COVID status. So this is them lying.
So it's not really the I see. It's them having COVID causes them to lie down. So it's kind of it's the label. It's not just the patient. But then the X sub C is kind of the lungs, right?
Yeah.
The Y is the label COVID applications, and the patient is causing the A.
Yes.
Not the X sub C.
Correct. Yeah. We there's like what you count as your object, your underlying true object, what you count as your label. Like there's a little bit of philosophy in there, right? In terms of like, there's a cow in this picture, but it's hiding behind the tree, so you can't see it. What do you want to do about that? Like, that's kind of the situation that makes us separate those two out. Yeah. So going back to our multi-attribute setup, I'll say that so rotation gives us an independent attribute. Color, we say is one of we're going to use as a caused attribute where the Y label causes the color. And then in the multi-attribution shift scenario, we are looking at a scenario where we have one attribute that's a causal relationship and one that is an independent relationship. And we find that our algorithm, CACM, actually does give you a benefit across all these scenarios. So up to, it outperforms both in the individual shift scenarios as well as in the combination of shifts. The key is that we're able to identify the correct regularizer under multi-attribution shifts. So
Sorry, on the previous slide, they say the plus minuses, those are common intervals.
yes, so ran the analysis multiple times and then got the bounds. What our approach is to do is, instead of picking a single static regularizer, we pull out the correct regularizer by looking at the causal graph, and use that to derive the correct independence constraints and apply those constraints through as a regularizer on the loss function. So we go through a bit of theory about the independence constraints. I'll just say that the key I think the key takeaway I want to emphasize here is that the conditional independence constraints that we can read off the causal graph end up being a necessary condition for identifying X sub C, but they are not sufficient. While we apply them as a loss, it constrains us to find better models. It doesn't get us the one true model. There's still more that can be done to narrow things down, but it is necessary. So when we look and talk about what are the independence constraints that we can read off of this graph, here is an example that we can read off on the on these sides. So here we've got our X sub C, and one of the independencies that we can read off is that X sub C is independent of a cause. And so we're going to, when we're building our model of X sub C, we're going to impose a constraint that says that it has to be independent of a cause, conditionally based on Y and E. So Y, if we condition on Y, then for any given value of Y, X sub C and a cause are now no longer correlated with each other from this in this causal graph. And so we can if we impose that condition, we're going to be learning a model of X sub C that's consistent with this graph. We can optionally also add E. Whether that's a good idea or not is more a question of variance versus bias trade-offs than causal correctness. But there are other constraints that, for example, some regularizers impose that say X sub C and a cause are independent given the environment that are incorrect given this causal graph.
In this case, for your approach, like I need to specify the graph given my domain knowledge of you, right? And then again, okay, let's say you have images of just X-rays, and you, the expert, will encode that there's the line, just outline, like sitting position, or maybe do some annotations, and then you can train a classifier using both the causal graph and the set of the images. Is that right?
That's right. So you're going to have your images, you're going to have your attribute values, and then you're going to have the domain knowledge that tells you what is the relationship between your target label and your attribute values. You can read those off of the complete causal graph if you have them. Otherwise, it's sufficient in many cases to simply know whether it's causal or confounded or selection bias. So you can give the sketch of the relationship to learn this relationship. But if you have the full causal graph, then you also have the potential to handle like latent attributes and kind of do a more thorough analysis. Now, if we're looking at the confounded case, though, now in this case, X sub C is independent of the attribute A, given E is the correct constraint, whereas conditioning on Y and E is the wrong constraint. So this is to say that just to highlight that the same constraint is not valid across all data generating processes. And so we can develop these constraints for every single one of those different types of attributes, and highlight that no single independence constraint is valid across all shifts. Which means that this is now leads to our explanation of why we empirically see that none of the existing domain generalization algorithms work across all kinds of distribution shifts. So we explain that kind of puzzle now. I don't go into it in this deck, but if you're curious, we do the mapping from like what is the specific domain generalization algorithm in practice, and what independence constraint are they effectively imposing in their loss function. So we do make that mapping and show that it predicts which ones are going to work well on. Yeah. Okay. We impose this conditional independence constraint as a regularization penalty, where we apply an MMD constraint to the loss function based on each of the specific independence constraints that we've read off from the graph. And so for a general graph now, you can go through every observed variable A and iterate through all the potential independence constraints, and then pull those in to your loss function for arbitrary graphs, and apply the regularization penalty in the same way. Yeah.
I think in some of the constraints you had, I think you were conditioning on that catch-all variable E.
Yeah.
How do you do that for imposing, like, do you impose any regularization constraints that consider E? And what is E in that case?
Yeah.
If it's kind of this catch-all environment impacting this.
So in E, E is a little bit different because there's actually, I talked to E about E as being a catch-all, where E is causing all of your attributes A. Well, there's actually, I hid something under the covers there, and that's that E does not have a relationship to Y in this graph. And it turns out other than through the A's. And so it turns out that whether it's causally necessary or not depends on whether this arrow. So if you have a relationship between E and Y, then you need to condition on E. Otherwise, it's a kind of bias variance trade-off.
I understand that basically by construction and assumption, you never need to consider E in the regularization constraints for causal correctness.
In this version of the graph. In the paper, we talk about the general scenario. Okay. Okay. So I'll get into empirical results now, but just I'll pause to say we have implemented a version of CACM in the DoY library. There's a causal prediction API in there now, and so you can go and play with it as well. So on to the empirical validation. So we already saw the superior performance of CACM, which stands for causally adaptive constraint minimization, on the rotated and colored MNIST examples. And here we're going to consider a more challenging task where there's a multi-valued classes and attributes over realistic 3D objects. This is similar to the analysis that Wiles did, but we're going to apply it actually using the small NORB dataset, which is a standard object recognition dataset that allows us to pull data that's been about objects that have been photographed at different angles, different lighting conditions, etc. We validate, first of all, that none of the existing algorithms do well across all shifts. And in fact, we see that ERM does outperform the domain generalization algorithms in this scenario. And then when we add in CACM, though, and are able to pick the right independence constraints out from the data generating process, we see that it provides up to a 20% improvement across the board.
So I actually have a question.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question to see kind of like all connect. So let's say I have like the English, for example, I have my just X-rays. So I have my X sub C and then X, that's my image. And then I want to build a classifier that's going to label it, and the label will be COVID versus non-COVID. And then I know I have a set of variables, like if the person lying down or the person. How are these variables actually extracted? Is this something that you also kind of build in the same classifier to extract those variables and saying, well, this classifier actually needs to identify all these variables, and they are all connected, and we need this regularization so that you learn the relationship effect. Is that how you collect it?
In our training scenario, we assume that you already have access to the attributes A, that you know they're the features. So that's kind of the setting in this paper. You don't need them once you deploy. So once you deploy, you built your model that analyzes the images, and it knows how to filter out the signals from the other attributes.
See, so then kind of in your model, then you walk us through, so you have the image.
Yeah.
And then you see that you're also given a table with these extra attributes, right?
Yes.
And then from this, you get, okay, so now the input, so you're going to still update that classifier. The classifier actually has to work taking as input both the images and those extra variables.
Yeah.
And then you change the regularization so that it correctly announced.
Yes. So those extra attributes are applied in the loss function during learning, but then once you've learned it, you don't need access to those attributes again. Yeah. You talked about you gave an interesting question of, would it be possible to jointly learn these other attributes at the same time? We haven't investigated that, but I would like to think there's a possibility to do that type of joint learning or iterative learning. Maybe we learn one, right? And then once we learn one really well, then we don't need that label anymore. We can use the model predicted label in the future, right? And kind of expand.
Because you can imagine that for each one of these variables, you could build a classifier to detect that variable, and then they all will interact.
Yes. Now, the thing that we're not going to be protected against, though, is, just to be clear, is that if there's any attributes that you forget to add into your data set, all right, you'll be protected against distribution shifts in the variables that you are aware of and that you gave to your model training process initially, but you're not going to be protected against the others. The environment label provides a little bit of protection against the attributes that it kind of acts as a proxy for. But to the degree that those variables start to shift independently, you're not going to get the full protection.
To give you the values of those variables for the training examples and the kinds of variables they are.
Yes. Yeah.
Is the environment label like a column in your tabular data set?
Yeah.
It's like which hospital was it from, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. There's some work. So you talked about like the hospital that's from, as if the environment is a categorical label, and that's usually the setting, the way that people think about it. But there are kind of slightly different approaches you can take that encode the environment as a continuous label too.
Okay.
Yeah. A continuous variable. So there's a couple of things, okay, so great. Here's a nice table that kind of shows that the algorithm gives a pretty significant improvement. There's a couple of things we wanted to show. One is that, validating that the incorrect constraints really do hurt generalization. And we see that if you, use your correct constraint, things go well. If you use your incorrect constraint, then as you increase your penalty coefficient, you see things getting worse. And when we see that applying the same constraints across all shifts also hurts generalization. So for example, the constraint that's conditioned on Y has superior performance in the causal and selected shifts, but doesn't do well in the confounded case, for example. Okay, so that's actually the end of the talk. So some of the key takeaways. One is that I think this. We think that one of the kind of the key takeaways, the title of the paper is that it's really that it's necessary to model these causal relationships that are in the data generating process in order to achieve out-of-domain generalization. If you don't do that, if you rely on a single constraint, then you're not going to handle all kinds of distribution shifts. But if you know what the relationship is, then you can pick the correct adaptive constraint. You don't need this. You'll be able to take a more sophisticated approach if you know the full causal graph, but you don't really need that. You can simply characterize what kind of causal relationship, causal selection bias, etc. you have between your attributes and your target label, and derive the constraints based on that. And I'll come back to our open source tools and kind of broader efforts. and emphasize really kind of, I don't know, we're getting a lot out of learning from this practical usage to drive inspire our fundamental work as well. Yeah, that's the end of the talk.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Question. So as a user, like if let's say I start to build a model, like I don't know all this extra, like the causal graph. Like I'm going to throw chat space and say build a model, and then maybe just is there a way or is there any support you provide for and figuring out the kind of incremental need that there might be so much parameters that are like issues?
We don't have a great way of inferring potential latent factors that you aren't aware of. There might be some approaches we could do that would run a sensitivity analysis, but that's something I have more experience with in like the tabular realm rather than in this high dimensional realm right now. If you have examples of data from a completely new environment, then that can tell you a little bit about whether you're, what type of shift you might be seeing.
But it's almost like once the user starts to deploy their model, and if they get new data, then the system can tell them there's some kind of shift here because my SIP performance dropped.
Yeah.
And you think of differences between these environments, but then the user will have to say, oh, I see the difference and then add that.
Yes.
Kind of the causal relationship.
Yeah.
They might or might not get right.
They might or might not get right. Yeah. Yeah. We're actually talking about that pulls into our kind of that first fundamental research challenge, which is that people have a hard time expressing their domain knowledge in causal terms. So the kind of the approaches we're taking to resolve that, one is we're looking into different kinds of causal discovery algorithms that can, under a very different set of assumptions, more like parametric assumptions, identify a causal graph, or at least a Markov equivalence class.
Try to say, specific algorithms I can possibly think of, and can you see if you find any relationship in my data, and then I can maybe reason about it. Yes. Although there can be some, the user can also be misled because if there is some relationship in the data, the user might think, oh yeah, this is causal. It's, yeah, you have to have some confidence in the user, and there's a back and forth. The second thing we're looking at is bootstrapping these causal graphs in some domains where we have trusted simulators. So if you think about domains like, I don't know, fluid flow, for example, where we have simulators that work pretty well, we can pull out causal relationships from there. The third one that's come up recently is that for a lot of, it looks like the larger language models encode a lot of the domain knowledge for kind of general tasks, at least, in which case we're looking at whether we can query the language model to give us a bootstrap of a graph. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I was talking. I just did the literature. I just did all the compounding factors on people. It's so there's a benchmark called the Tübingen causal discovery benchmark, and Amit Sharma, my collaborator from India, he ran an analysis where he asked ChatGPT about each of the pairwise relationships that are the tasks in this Tübingen benchmark, and state-of-the-art algorithms look at data, the underlying data, and get about 70 to 80% correct. ChatGPT doesn't know how to look at the data. So it only looked at like the variable names and got about 90, 92% right. So it is encoding a lot of the domain knowledge that you'd expect, which is exciting. It means that we can reduce the burden. If that holds up and we figure out how to use it correctly. Expertise that comes up so often. Yes, if it can capture it, and we can figure out how to avoid the over-reliance on those models and things, right? And especially in risky scenarios, then we can take a lot of burden off of the human, which is kind of cool.
Someone else there.
Oh.
Steve. You want to ask a question? Ask that? I'll do it.
Sorry, was that directed at me online?
Oh, yeah.
I think only.
Oh, okay, only I can. All right. I'm on, my speaker's up.
Let's. Bill, can ask the question?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I wasn't clear if you were talking about me or not. I only heard the mumbling in the background. Great talk. I'm not sure I have a super coherent question, but we've done some work on in somewhat similar areas, although not really trying to explicitly encode the causal relationships like you have. It's more of, we know that a bias exists in the real world, for example, around gender or race or something, and we're kind of hoping to control for it without really knowing for sure how well it's represented in the data set. And some of the things we've done work pretty well when you stay with color dimness and these kinds of relationships where we can kind of control for the bias. We know exactly how it was constructed, but it got a little harder to see in more general data sets, like some sort of celebrity face kind of data set where that there might be some gender bias there, but the situation is much more complex. And so I was wondering if you might wanted to comment on, do you think that some of the results that you have where you have a kind of a laboratory controlled causal relationship that's been injected into the data set, and you shown some great results on being able to kind of tease that apart, is anything going to get harder when you sort of get more general data sets where in some sense everything's connected to everything causally? And it's a little harder to have these strong relationships. So I apologize for the incoherency of the question, but I guess I'm wondering how we get out of those kind of laboratory data sets into the real world. Is anything going to get harder to do, or are you still pretty confident that these approaches will work?
There's two things that I think are worth. Okay, sorry. All right. I had my mic off for a second. There's two things that I think are going to cause potential problems as we generalize beyond these lab experiments. One is that at least in these four different kinds of attributes that we've characterized here and the independence constraints that they imply, we don't account for variables causing each other, which makes things a little more complicated. And so that requires you to go to the general purpose causal graph to pull out the right independence constraint, not necessarily just reading off the causal confounded selection bias or independent constraint here. The other thing is, in the paper we have a note about the selection bias, and that's that the independence constraint that we impose for the selection bias actually requires one additional assumption to be made about the data, and that's about positivity. If your selection bias, and so the kind of way to explain this is, if your selection bias is so harsh that you never see data from a particular part of your space, then you're not going to get any guarantees about generalizing to that. Yeah. The other two are more straightforward. They don't require that additional assumption. So those would be the things that, like, if you have more complex relationships among your attributes and things, then you should use a general algorithm to pull out the right independence constraints, and it might be hard to find them in some cases. And then the other one is that additional assumption for getting the independence constraint over the selection bias.
Thanks.
If I understood it correctly, like you could take these constraints and use them to regularize your model in your loss function. To what degree, like say you have some labeled data in your target domain, to what degree can we break can we trade off some of the understanding of what constraints are the right ones and kind of what the graph really looks like, kind of a model selection cross-validation problem? So you have kind of like your lambda times regularization. What if you had lambda 1 to lambda 10 for any of the different types And then you kind of break it down to like a hyperparameter optimization model selection search. I'd love to hear your reflection in terms of how far that goes and how quickly it breaks apart.
Possibly, maybe offline, I'll pull up a paper by other authors that I saw at a NeurIPS workshop, where they were doing exactly that. They weren't relying on like the causal graph assumptions, but they were picking models based on knowledge of the target domain under like in a way that felt like it could be connected to this work, but we haven't done that work.
So I'm thinking of a situation where a user kind of is adding independence assumptions one at a time, right? And as you noted, like they have the wrong ones, it gets way worse. But if there's like you have basically a subgraph of the causal model that you're adding to over time, would you expect performance to kind of monotonically get better as you added more of the correct independence constraints? Or is there a situation where users could add some subset of them that causes a problem because others are not represented?
Given that each of them is it's a necessary constraint, I think that it would only get better. But there might be statistical considerations that I'm not thinking of.
Questions, just on those who can.
Can you please elaborate on the attribute selection process for this algorithm?
You mean how we choose what the A's should be?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I didn't go into that at all. That's something that where we rely on the human, the domain expert, to determine what are the attributes that are also influencing X.
Do they have to be entirely correct when selected by these domain experts, or can they be somehow noisy in that regard? Or partial?
If you say that an attribute does not have an arrow going somewhere, then that has to be correct. If you say that it has an arrow and it turns out it doesn't, that's okay. The influence, the weight on that edge can be 0 and still be, technically correct. So it would be okay for you to have like a superset of variables that all have arrows going into X, and it turns out that they don't actually have an influence. That might make it harder to learn from like the statistical point of view, but it would, from the causal perspective, still be okay. It is important to have kind of this correct though. Like if you believe that it is related to your target label Y, you do have to know which one of these it is.
Interesting. Yeah. The reason I'm asking is because I'm thinking of the literature on programmatic weak supervision, where users, sometimes even domain experts, write these so-called labeling functions, which in a way help explain some of the why labels. So I was thinking of brainstorming whether this really would be possible to merge at least these two paradigms, have like labeling function that can somehow be massively generated by users. And of course, they're somehow noisy and may potentially use them as attributes to improve the causal the prediction across a variety of distributions.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. I'm not super familiar with that literature. Maybe we could talk more offline. Yeah, that sounds very related. A good way of gathering that domain knowledge. Thank you very much.